This video is going to provide an overview of the diversity of fungi, but just an overview. And so as I go through the individual videos, there may be some which go into some of the topics in greater detail, such as the life cycles and the haploid, diploid number of chromosomes per cell. And if you wanted to go into something in more detail, you might want to view each of the individual videos. So when we look at the eukaryotic groups of organisms, plants are not closely related to animals. Algae and the various groups of algae are not closely related to animals. Fungi are, however. And so not only, for example, does chitin make up the exoskeleton of, say, arthropods, we can then also find it in the cell wall of fungi. And so in the great family tree of Protists and all of its groups, fungi are closer to animals. Now, just to try to understand fungi, perhaps comparing them to animals, there are some similarities in that both are chemoheterotrophs, which means that where do they get their energy? Well, they're getting it from breaking down, say, sugars, proteins, biomolecules of other living things. They're not using sunlight, they're not oxidizing minerals. So they're getting their energy from, these other chemicals. Where are they getting their organic carbon? So when you look at a fungus or an animal, where does the carbon of its sugar and amino acids come from? Well, not from carbon dioxide that was converted to sugar. Rather, it has to absorb it from the environment. So all of the carbon in my body that composes sugars and proteins, etc., I had to ingest. It came into my body as part of my food, the biomolecules of other former living things. And the same is true of fungi. The carbon that makes up a fungus is obtained from previously other living things. So fungi and animals are similar in that sense. Animals move, fungi don't. They kind of grow into their food. So while an animal might hunt its prey, fungi then grow into it. Animals, make, this big mass of cells which can form, tissues and organs. Fungi instead form these microscopic strands known as hyphae, and then the mass of all of the hyphae altogether is what's known as a mycelium. Most of the cells of animals have 2 copies of each chromosome. They're diploid, and then when sex cells are made, they're haploid. In contrast, most of the fungal cells are haploid, and very often the only diploid cells occur after reproductive cells fuse and only last for one cell cycle. Animal cells don't have a cell wall. Fungal cells do, and this cell wall is made of chitin. And so this was just then kind of a comparison of some of the big features. Now, if you wanted to observe a fungus, a lot of us, might think automatically of, say, a mushroom, but that's actually not the best example, because that like macroscopic structure, the mushroom, that's not the fungus. It's only a part of the fungus, and in that case, the reproductive part. The major part of a typical fungus is what we call a hypha, or in plural, hyphae. Hyphae are these microscopic thread-like strands which you see here. In the hyphae, sometimes the cells are all separate from each other. Sometimes there's little perforations, so some materials can go back and forth. And some hyphae have something which I videotaped and showed in a previous video on the slime molds, where there are no cell walls anymore. And so all of the cell's material are kind of free to go back and forth. So there's multiple cells, but they're just not separate from each other. So what you're looking at here are masses of hyphae, and a mass of hyphae is what's called a mycelium. So if you ever see a mushroom, just because that's an easy example, if you ever see a mushroom popping up out of the soil, once again, that's not the fungus. That's just the reproductive part of the fungus. The rest of the fungus is actually in the soil, this mat, this mycelium, made of all of these microscopic strands, so it can be quite large. How large? Well, we don't know, and we should be open-minded to, thinking of life in a new way. So if you were to say sample hyphae in one area and do a DNA analysis, and then go far away and sample hyphae, you might actually find that you have the same individual located a great distance away. So for example, there is a fungus known to be 2,000 acres in size. Now, what happens is, you see, in one area there's hyphae, and far away over there are hyphae, but the hyphae are just growing through the soil, and we're trying to, wrap our minds around, how big fungi can get, apparently larger than many of us think. So for example, you might think these are multiple fungi. Oh, there's a bunch of fungi here, but it could just be one individual. So there's one mass of hyphae known as a mycelium that occasionally puts up reproductive structures. So once again, we don't think of fungi in that way, but once again, we should, and so this is what composes the body of a fungus. One of the things we talk about with organisms is how they reproduce. And when it comes to fungi, let's not do it much, because we use this term called a spore. So fungi don't have seeds, they have spores. These are these reproductive structures. They tend to be small, they don't have many nutrients around them. What can we say about spores? Well, at least for right now, preferably as little as possible. And the reason I say that is I'd like to say where spores fit into a life cycle. But fungi can have different stages of their life cycle. They can have an asexual, they can have a haploid phase, a diploid phase. And so some spores are asexual, just kind of a cloning of one phase. Then you could have asexual spores, which are cloning another phase. You could have sexual spores. One single fungus can have multiple kinds of spores, which are made at different points of its life cycle. And that's just in one fungus. And then when you compare a fungus in this group to a fungus in that group, the spores over here might not be the same as the spores over there. These are sexual, these are asexual, etc. And so there are a great diversity of structures, which we simply refer to as spores in fungi, and perhaps we should leave it at that. Now, one of the things which we should focus on is they do have an impact on human health, because we breathe in spores all the time. There are molds, there are mildews, and this can trigger inflammatory responses. And so if we're looking at what is causing the worsening of asthma, or how might climate change affect organisms, which then affects humans, the effects on spore production, which then affects our inflammatory responses in our lungs. This is something to weigh into that. That mushroom in that last video, mushrooms produce spores. That's the reason for a mushroom. So once again, this isn't the fungus. The fungus is the hyphae in the soil that puts up this reproductive mushroom, which then releases spores. Okay. So fungi, where do they fit in the grand scheme of things? Well, fungi are really diverse, and so therefore they have lots of effects on, say, plants, on animals. And I'd like to quickly just review some. One, they are very important as decomposers. So here's a dead fish. Obviously, the fly larvae are going to get some of this fish, but it would be a shame if then this dead fish took all of its stuff with it, because there's sugar, there's protein, there's no nutrients there. And if every dead thing was buried with its nutrients, then that would be less for the world around us. There would be less stuff than for living things. And so, just quite frankly, this stuff that you see here, I didn't invent it. There's sugar here, there's proteins, there's calcium, but I didn't invent this. This stuff had former owners. All right, so living things tends to recycle stuff. I was once very small. I was an infant once. The reason I got bigger was because I got stuff from other living things. Now that's my stuff, And, unfortunately, but back to life, it won't be my stuff forever. And then after me, this stuff will belong to other living things. And so we depend on the cycling of stuff, of carbon, of nitrogen, of, all of these nutrients. And thus these chemoheterotrophs, these decomposers, they're very important in this. So these fungi are getting their energy, they're getting their carbon from other living things, including many dead things. So they can be saprobes or decomposers, in that they then grow into the dead fish, secrete all of these enzymes which digest it. So we think of digestion where we take something into our stomach. All right, so we take something, we move it into our stomach, we digest it there. Fungi grow into whatever it is that they're digesting, secrete enzymes outside of their cells, and kind of digest their food outside their bodies, and then absorb the nutrients from there. So that's important. It recycles this stuff. Now, that's great because everyone loves a decomposer. However, if fungi are then good at decomposing, say, dead animal stuff, it's not that far a leap to grow into living animal tissue and digest that. And so there are some diseases which can be caused by fungi. So two big examples. Millions of bats in North America have been killed by what's called the white nose syndrome. While they're all huddled together in hibernation, there's a fungus which can infect them. It grows into their skin. It, obviously irritates them. And the problem for bats is instead of sleeping all winter and conserving their energy, they're constantly being woken up and irritated, etc. They run out of energy early in their winter in hibernation. And when they're out of energy reserves, they have to go out and hunt for food. But if they've been moving around far more than they needed to, they run out of energy before spring and the insects come out. So they get out of hibernation. They have to go find food because they're starving, but they leave when it's still winter. And obviously then there's no food and then they starve to death. And so this fungus has decimated bat populations, and bats provide billions of dollars of free insect control. A bat can eat, the weight of its body in mosquitoes every night, and so the loss of bats then certainly affects humans. As I had mentioned, when we constantly inflame, was that here? No, I think I get back to it. Oh, I'm sorry. Zoom and YouTube. Work. Okay, so here's a second infection in frogs. There is a fungus we can simply call BD, using its genus and species name, that infects frogs and has decimated many populations. In fact, may be a cause of extinction. So entire species may be going extinct because of this fungal infection. And it may be that our aquarium trade, as we swap all of these organisms, and share them, has contributed to the spread of this fungus. In our lungs, our bronchioles, when they become inflamed, get thicker, and this can be the cause of asthma. And so, the inflammation, as I mentioned, of our lungs is certainly an issue. And while, say, in like my mouth, there could be yeast there. Yeast is something that we can find on our skin, on our mouths. It tends not to bother me. So I tend not to be likely to get thrush, a yeast infection. But that could change if I was immunocompromised. And so while fungi are not major parasites in humans, so for example, they can cause athlete's foot, there could be a fungal infection that I might get if I'm in a cave that's full of bats and I'm breathing in that air, there could be a lung infection there. But for the most part, human diseases are more bacterial. But some fungal infections are opportunistic. So yeast isn't primarily a parasite, but nevertheless, it could cause a disease in me given the opportunity. So if I was immunocompromised for another reason. There are a number of benefits that the fungi can have. So for example, these cows can digest the cellulose of the grass that they're eating, in part because of fungi which live in their intestines. So there's a group called the Mycelium that live inside the guts of these ruminant animals, and then helps them digest their food. Animals can sometimes serve as prey even. So microscopic animals like these nematode worms, and I'll show you a video soon, can actually be prey for predatory fungi. So fungi can have lots of interrelationships with animals. Fungi can have lots of interrelationships with plants. Once again, they can be decomposers and saprobes, which then means that once again, they're cycling these nutrients. Plants need nutrients. The roots want to absorb nutrients from the soil, like nitrogen and phosphorus and others. And so the ability of fungi to decompose dead plants then provides nutrients in the soil then for living plants. So this is a very beneficial relationship. Once again, the fungi are growing into the dead plant material. They secrete enzymes, they digest the plant outside the body of the fungus, and this then liberates the nutrients. Sure, the fungus is taking up some, but now the nutrients are just in the soil, and so obviously, others, animals, organisms could access it as well. Now, while fungi are not major parasites in animals, they can be, but they're not major parasites. They are major parasites in plants. And so if the fungi in the soil can decompose, say, the cellulose and the lignin in the cell walls and in the wood of dead plants, well, once again, it's not that great a leap to now being able to do that in living plants as well. So there are a lot of diseases in plants which are caused by fungi. We call some of them molds, some of them are called mildews, some of them are called rusts, some of them are called smuts. But there's a lot of diseases then as these fungi can then actually decompose dead things. I'll show video more on this in the future. But there's a group of organisms called Lycans, which isn't technically a plant, but it's an algae. So it's a symbiosis. So fungi are working together with algae. And therefore they form a team where the fungus, gives structure and protection. The algae is doing photosynthesis and providing sugar. And so lichens that you might see growing on trees or on bare rocks, the fungi are in a symbiotic relationship with algae. As I will get into it in a tiny bit more detail in just a minute, fungi are essential for many types of plants, and certainly they benefit most because they actually interact with the roots. So if you were to pull up a plant by the roots, you might say, look at all these plant cells. Yeah, but actually there's also fungal cells there as well. They can be growing around the cells of the plant within the plant root. They can even be growing within the cells of the plant and the plant root. So most plants have fungi associated with their roots, which we call mycorrhizae, which are absorbing nutrients and water to help the plant out. Most plants are benefited by this. By most, I mean 90%, give or take, but some plants absolutely need it. So if you're trying to grow an orchid, for example, if you don't have the specific type of fungi that it needs for its roots, then it might not grow. So the plant alone can't, potentially live without the fungus, which forms a symbiotic relationship with it. And in the fossil record, there's actually fossils of mycorrhizae going back to really early in the days of plants. So it may be not only do mycorrhizal fungi help plants now, it may be that going back to the origin of plants or the diversification of many of the first plants, that fungi had a major role in the adaptation of plants to land. So here, for example, is a video where you can see some plant cells, but here you can see a mildew. So this mildew is not decomposing dead plant stuff. It's decomposing living plant stuff. And so you might ask, what part of the plant is that? That's not. Those are the spores of the mildew growing around the plant. So there are different kinds of mildews. And here you can see, once again, this is fungi being parasitic on plants. Here is something called a rust. These are the plant cells, but these are all the fungi. So notice that the fungi are growing into the plant material, digesting it. Here you can see all of the spores that they are making. And this is what's called a smut in corn. And so then there would be different ones. So there's, this corn smut, there's the white pine rust. So there would be all of these different fungal diseases, which would affect, say, individual plant species. Now, I had mentioned this as well. Some fungi, they're growing throughout the medium, digesting, I don't know, the materials in dead wood or whatever. And there are many animals which are microscopic. So here's a microscopic worm, for example, called a nematode. There are other microscopic animals such as rotifers. Well, what these fungi can then do is they can, as they grow out, and they're capable of doing this without the worms, but since worms are sources of energy and nitrogen, etc., they can then make little lassos that as the worm swims through the media, crawls over it, could get stuck. So if you look very closely here, this worm has been tethered. This fungus grew a little lasso, and this worm, as it moved through it, got stuck. And that's it for the worm. It's going to remain trapped. And now the fungus is going to grow into the cells of the worm and slowly digest it. So here is a fungus, which is actually a predator of an animal. I've changed the view of the microscope. So here you can see kind of at a height. So the worm is down below, but if you think of like trees in a forest, here's the tops of the trees. Those were the spore-producing conidia of the fungus. So for example, you might see there, it was out of focus because I was focusing on the bottom. But here on the bottom, there was a vertical a strand where the spores were produced. And so there are, here, you can see that by this point, the fungi have completely digested the worms. The worms are dead, and the hyphae are growing into them. And so this is unusual, but nevertheless, one more interaction between fungi and animals is that some fungi are actually predators of animals. I had mentioned cytoplasmic streaming. So if hyphae don't make cell walls in between the cells of in a hyphae once they reproduce, then you can have material flow back and forth. Now this is a slime mold where you're seeing kind of the flow of just nuclei and all of the stuff. But in fungi, you could get this same, a similar cytoplasmic streaming. Before getting into some individual groups of fungi, just a couple of thoughts. Once again, as I mentioned in the fossil record, when did fungi start? Well, the problem is, since fungi are made of these, microscopic strands known as hyphae, obviously finding fossils of microscopic strands, that would be tough. Now, as we'll see, one of the most primitive types of fungus is found in aquatic environments, including the ocean. So that we think that in addition to yeast, which are one-celled, so when we find here in the green section, fossils of protist cells, big eukaryotic cells, it could be that some of these are fungal cells, because yeast are fungi which are only one cell big, they're unicellular. So, here we could include, yeast-like unicellular fungal cells. The animals first appear from about 700 million years ago. Fungi, are like a sister group of animals. So they may go back to around the same time. And since life began in the ocean, and one of the most primitive groups of fungi are aquatic, then it could very well be that in these things we find in the ocean, this would include fungal cells. Now, the Ordovician period, which you see there are then definite fungi on land by that point. And as I had mentioned, as we get into the Silurian, you're getting the early mid Paleozoic era, then certainly those mycorrhizae are known with plant roots. The earliest plants include fossils which had fungi associated with their roots. So it may be that just like fungi are a major reason that plants are successful on land today, this actually might go back to the very first plants as well. Now, the very first plants were not trees, all right? They didn't grow that tall yet. But in the mid Paleozoic era, there was this weird living thing, which was the largest living thing on Earth. Its name is Prototaxites. It was originally thought to be like a weird gymnosperm or something when it was first found. But it's now considered as a fungus, kind of like, imagine a huge mushroom that can grow to be a pillar, maybe 25 feet tall or so. And so there was a time before plants produced tree-like structures that the tallest structures on Earth would have been fungi. Now, once again, this would have been the fruiting body of a fungus, so that there would have been a much larger mycelium growing around that. So that's odd, and an interesting aspect then of fossil fungi. So fungi are a kingdom, and when we think of the kingdom Animalia, there's certainly a difference between me and a sponge, although we're both in the same kingdom, we're both animals. A difference between, a fish and an insect, and so the same thing in the kingdom of fungi. It's very diverse. There's certainly a lot of different kinds. So, for example, yeast are unicellular. So all animals are made of more than one cell. All animals are multicellular. All plants are multicellular. Almost all fungi are multicellular. The exception is yeast. So yeast are unicellular fungi. They can divide by budding one cell off of another, and they are critically important for our economy, as I'll explain. Now, if yeast are put in an environment when there's no air, instead of breaking down sugar to make carbon dioxide and I'm sorry, my fault. I misread this. I said, I should put aerobic first. It turns out it did. My bad. So in an aerobic environment, so when there's oxygen, this yeast is metabolizing sugar just like I do. All right. So if I eat sugar, then I break that down into carbon dioxide and water. So yeast can do the same. All right. However, what interests us, economically more is that when yeasts are in an anaerobic environment with no oxygen. So I can't break down sugar without oxygen, but yeast can. But instead of producing carbon dioxide and water, they then produce alcohol. All right. They do produce a little bit of carbon dioxide. This carbon dioxide is what makes bread rise. So if you have a mass of bread, it's anaerobic in the middle. Oxygen isn't getting in there. So the yeast are then making alcohol and carbon dioxide. The alcohol will burn off in the process of baking, but the carbon dioxide is what will help the bread to rise. Obviously, some of the interest in yeast is if you give it sugar, and this could be from different plant sources, so it should be sugarcane or potatoes, or barley or whatever. If you give yeast sugar sources, then they'll produce alcohol. And so then by giving yeast different types of plants. So if you give them grapes, as they break down the sugars in grapes to make alcohol, then this would then produce wine. And then obviously you can, make rum, you can make vodka, and beer, etc. So yeast are fungi which have a huge economical significance. Obviously, bread and alcohol are two things that humans use a great deal. Now, so yeast might give us a little glimpse into, fungi which are unicellular. So thus, fungi could have started out simpler than the majority of fungi today. One of the primitive groups of fungi are known as the chytrids. Now, they're a little complicated, so maybe I'll just say a few general words about them. They're aquatic. They can be found in freshwater. They can also then be found in the ocean. And their spore-like structures, they swim with flagella. So they have asexual spores, they have sexual spores, which are capable of then swimming with their flagella. And so while we think most of the fungi on land, there is an aquatic group of fungi. Now they can be decomposers of dead stuff in aquatic environments, but they can also be parasites, parasites on fish, parasites on algae. So once again, once you learn how to decompose the stuff of living things, you could do that for dead living things, but it's not that far a leap to then be a parasite on actual living things. And some of these chytrids then infect the skin of frogs, and their effects are so great that some species may actually go extinct because of these chytrids. And so I have a video on their life cycle. That's a bit more advanced, so by all means feel free to watch it. They have a diploid phase, they have a haploid phase, they produce swimming spores at each point. So it is a little, a more complex. I'd just like to, before moving back onto land, a comment on fungi in the ocean. So, for example, there is a common fungus on land known as Aspergillus, but it also ends up in the ocean. All right. Now, obviously, it's going to end up a little in the ocean because their spores are everywhere, and the spores can end up in water, and the water can end up in the ocean. So some of this may be accidental, so that fungi accidentally end up in the ocean, but they intended to be on land. But it turns out they can grow into hyphae and then can be decomposers. And then you could ask the question, well, maybe they're primarily a decomposer on land, but if they're in the ocean, they can make do. Okay, maybe. But then there are not only fungi in the water and in the soil, in shallow water, but also in deep water, in sediments deep under the ocean. And so even though there may be some kind of accidental movement of primarily terrestrial fungi into the ocean, fungi do seem to be capable of living out their much of their life cycle or their entire life cycle in aquatic environments, including the ocean. But remember that fungi form these microscopic strands. That makes them very hard to study. So if you're at the bottom of the ocean, are there fungi in the sediment which are decomposers and playing a role in food chains? There probably are, but you would then need to sample that and then do like analysis of DNA simply because of microscopic strands being hard to study. So the reality is fungi are in the ocean and in aquatic environments, but we don't have an excellent handle on their diversity and their ecological roles. Another video I had kind of alluded to earlier, when you take a plant root, half of it could not be plant. Half of it could be fungus by weight. So there are certain plants where they have to have these mycorrhizal extensions, but about 90% of plants have them as a benefit. And so, many plants might be able to live without them, but they just don't do as well. These mycorrhizae, say in pink here, they extend from the plant root. All right, they have these microscopic strands. These microscopic strands can absorb water that then gets returned to the plant. These fungi can then digest the things in the environment, maybe getting nitrogen from the dead material in their environment. And this then can be returned to the plant. And in return, the plant doing photosynthesis and making sugar can send a little sugar into the fungus. So it's a relationship. Now, this mycorrhizal relationship where you see here, the fungus grows into the plant root, but then its hyphae then go between plant cells. So there's what's known as ectomycorrhizae, where the fungal hyphae are between the plant cells. But then there are also arbuscular mycorrhizae, where the fungus actually grows into the plant cell. But once again, it is not a parasite, it's a team, it's a symbiont, where the plant cell feeds the fungus sugar, whereas then the fungus is providing water, minerals, and nutrients to the fungus. All right, and so if you were to look in a plant root, you might say, oh, these are all plant cells. Yes, but within the plant cells, there are actually then cells of these mycorrhizal fungi. And once again, most plants have this relationship. Okay. One of the last things to go through is just there are different groups of fungi. And if you were to study them in a greater amount of detail, you would realize you'd have to go through their life cycles. So just quickly to give some illustrations. Bread molds belong to a group of fungi known as the Zygomycota. So in animals are a kingdom, but then you have the arthropods over here, the mollusks, you know, the chordates. Well, the same thing, you know, the fungi have the chytrids, they have the Zygomycota. And here they would reproduce with spores. The spores could say, find their way into bread. And then the hyphae would then grow out throughout the bread. Now, just like there can be male and female animals, male and female flowers in plants, there can be male and female fungi, although we probably refer to them more as opposite strains. Maybe you want to say plus strain, minus strain. So there can be opposite strains. Each of them can grow on their own. Each of them can produce spores. But when opposite strains meet, their strands then fuse. And instead of now a haploid strand, which has only one copy of each chromosome, they can form a new type of spore. All right, and once again, we could start naming everything. We could call this a zygospore. It could then produce a diploid structure, which then undergoes meiosis and produces haploid spores to start it all over again. So there can be different kind of genders, almost different, you know, strains, plus and minus, if you like, and there can be different stages of the life cycle where there's a haploid phase and a diploid phase. The biggest group of fungi is what's known as the Ascomycota or Ascomycetes. Yeast belong to this group. The defining, so do mildews and many of the other things you'll see. And the defining feature of the Ascomycota is a sac which holds the spores, which we can then call ascospores. All right, and so this is the biggest group of fungi, so they pop up a lot. So for example, when we talk about lichens, most lichens, not all, but most are the fungal component of them is an Ascomycota fungus, which then produces the spores in a sac-like structure or an elongated a structure here. So here you can see a lichen, the algae part that's more in the greenish part, but here you can see that the fungal part here is producing spores in an ascus. That's an Ascomycota. So that's the biggest group of fungi. The fungi we probably think of most are the mushrooms. That's the Basidiomycota. And once again, you can have haploid spores of two different strains. They kind of grow out and make different masses. But if opposite strains then touch, then the cells fuse. They form this weird phase, it's called a dikaryon phase, where now you have two nuclei per cell, but instead of smushing together and becoming a diploid nucleus, you now just have the two nuclei stay separate. So the cell has two nuclei in it, but they're two separate nuclei. And so we had, one mycelium growing over here, one mycelium growing over here. They were opposite strains. So when they come together, they form this new type of mycelium that has 2 nuclei per cell, and that's what then produces the mushroom. So the mushroom comes out of this dikaryon state, and then after the mushroom gets to a certain level of height and preparedness, then it undergoes meiosis to produce haploid spores, which then it liberates. That's the purpose of the mushroom, to then liberate the spores and be a reproductive structure. And I have another video here, just under the microscope of the mushroom part, the Basidiocarp, and the spores that it is then producing. So somewhere when it catches up. So you'll see under the microscopic views of all of the spores being produced within the Basidiocarp there. So here are spores inside the gills of the mushroom. I believe the last one is just to get back to lichens. So there are a number of examples where fungi form symbiotic relationships with other organisms, and here's one where fungi can form symbiotic relationships with algae, and this then allows them to grow on surfaces including bare rock. And so this is an importance as pioneer species, because here you can see the bare rock has these small lichens and another kind of lichen, but then and here's reindeer moss, that's another type of lichen, but then these lichens then trap more and more soil, and then at some point there might be enough soil for moss, and then there's enough soil for small plants, and there's enough soil for larger plants. And so these lichens not only are interesting in and of themselves, but they're important as a pioneer species. When you start off with bare rock, these are the first organisms which can colonize it, and thanks to them, a layer of soil then develops where now you can start to get taller plants taking advantage of the soil that they have helped to accumulate. And then so to wrap up, fungi are eukaryotic cells. And if we look at eukaryotic cells, there are certainly lots of kinds. Many of the kinds we call protists. And so protists form this family tree that had lots of lineages. One lineage included green algae, and then green algae came onto land and became land plants. So land plants are one branch of that came out of the protists. Choanoflagellates are protists which have some of the features of animals. So animals came out of this branch of the family tree. But then here, closely related to the branch which gave us the animals, are the fungi. And so there are protists called microsporidia. Some people have included them in the fungi, some haven't. They are obligate parasites. So from this branch, which once again includes some kinds of protists like microsporidia, which are similar to fungi, then come yeast, which are unicellular, and then the fungi, which are primarily multicellular. And so from these diverse protists, so we call that a kingdom, even though it's not a good biological group, we then have 3 kingdoms, which are either multicellular in plants and animals, or largely multicellular in the fungi, which we usually don't include in the protists, but nevertheless, they evolved from the protists.